From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
I've mentioned here before that I absolutely love scary movies. And I think I've mentioned that my favorite of all the scary movies is without question the original Exorcist movie. For my money, that's still the best of them all. They don't make movies like that anymore, and everything that made The Exorcist so great is everything I dislike about the current state of scary movies. The Exorcist didn't rely on constant scares. They were well-paced. It also didn't rely on sound effects and a score to fill all the quiet spaces within the film. And by not using those typical spooky background sounds that give you a clue that something is coming, it forces you to sit in the moment and hear every little sound. The wings on a fly, a train going by. It almost created a situation where your senses were heightened because you had no idea what was around the corner. The other effect it had was to create a feel that this was more of a documentary than a fictional film. If you go back to the episode we did last season with Nat Sigaloff on the 50th anniversary of the original film, we talk about the effect the film had on moviegoers at the time. For many, the film felt very real. It wasn't your traditional scary movie with some sort of monster at its center. This was something that felt like it could actually happen to anyone, especially if you were even mildly religious. And unlike a movie with a traditional monster, it was something that you couldn't see with your eyes, something more akin to a disease that got inside your body and spread like a plague. And that is absolutely terrifying. The idea that some unseen evil force could potentially take over your body and wreak absolute havoc against your will was something that was and is so horrifying that it literally caused people to start going back to church. And the scariest part of the entire thing is that unlike your traditional scary movies, this one is based in reality. When we go see a Friday the 13th movie, we can rest easy on our drive home that there isn't some supernatural psycho in a hockey mask murdering people out there with a machete. When we sit down to watch the classic film Dracula, we can laugh at ourselves after it's over because we know Dracula, the undead count who drinks blood and turns into a bat, doesn't actually exist. They're works of fiction. However, exorcisms do happen. They do exist and they're happening right now. Further, they don't just occur within the Catholic Church, and they're not just exclusive to Christianity. Belief in the demonic, the devil, and evil forces transcend time, culture, and religion. Through our modern lens, we may view these types of beliefs as archaic and outdated. There are many around the world who still believe, which brings me to this week's guest, Scott Smith. Scott is the author of the book, True Ghost Stories and Hauntings, Real Catholic Exorcisms. We talk about some of the biggest cases of Vatican-sanctioned exorcisms that actually happened. On this week's mystery, Real Exorcisms on From the Void. All right. Welcome to the podcast. I've got Scott L. Smith with me this week, author of Real Catholic Exorcisms. Thanks so much for coming on the show with me today.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This is one of those things that, to this day, I think the scariest movie I've ever seen, for my money, still to this day, is The Exorcist. And so I know why I'm fascinated by it, because it's so outside the norm and so terrifying. What got you into it originally?
Well, watching the movie didn't scare me as much. I think The Omen might have scared me more. But reading the book, I read the book in my college dorm room, and, there's parts, maybe they're deleted scenes in the actual movie, but there's parts in the book that are really creepy. Some things that are, and what I found studying this exorcism is that Hollywood wasn't Hollywoodizing these things. Like, these are not exaggerated in a lot of cases. But one of the scariest things is when she comes spider walking down the steps, yes. And her mom's not aware that this has happened, and she's just standing there talking. Her mom's an actress in the book, and she's just talking to somebody at the foot of the steps, and she feels something wet on her ankle. And she looks down, and her daughter the tongue is going in and out like a serpent's tongue, and moistening her ankle is just the creepiest thing.
Yeah, that's terrifying. I mean, but to your point, like some of these stories, I've studied some over the years, are the accounts are more horrifying than anything I could come up with for a horror movie.
Yeah.
So,
good luck, Hollywood.
Right. Yeah. So talk a little bit about one of the interesting things I found at the beginning of your book is the book recounts real exorcisms that took place and accounts that all seem to involve children.
Yeah.
Like you would think that children, you always think of as being more innocent. You think that these naughty adults would be the ones that would be like the targets, but yet it seems to be children and children sort of in that sort of preteen to teenage phase.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hope I don't offend too much. One of the things we will do as a family or used to, there are abortion clinics, and in my faith we pray for the end of that. Hopefully people can hear this and not be too turned off. But I will not bring my children across the street. Like we pray across the street from the abortion clinic, because until they have been baptized and confirmed, they are far too vulnerable and susceptible to this stuff latching on to them, bringing something home. Adam Bly, he's a lay psychologist, a layman, not a priest exorcist, but he assists exorcists. And when he became an assistant to exorcists in the Diocese of Pittsburgh, the priest asked him, "Are you married? Do you have children? Do you have pets?" And because if you have any of those three, you're going to bring something home with you, and it's going to be harmful. So it's children need protection, and as a Catholic, I believe they need sacramental protection, but we all need protection.
Yeah, that's wild. Like I remember reading years ago, and this will kind of lead up to my next question here, but I remember reading years ago, there was a psychologist that I really enjoyed, probably more so well known for writing the book that a lot of college kids have read, The Road Less Traveled by Dr. Peck.
Sure.
And he cleverly waited to the end of his career and pretty much, what would be the end of his life. But his last published book was a book called Glimpses of the Devil. And he recounts, I believe it's been some years since I read it, but it's 5 cases that he treats as like case studies, but he explains why, in his professional opinion, it couldn't have been some sort of psychological malady, and why in these 5 instances, he's like, I kind of am left with no other choice but to believe that this was a true possession, and then recounts calling in help and going through the rites of exorcism. So talk a little bit about the history of exorcisms within the Catholic Church, because, as we know, through both popular culture and through just, fact that the Catholic Church is primarily the main institution that really combats, or I should say, conducts exorcisms. So they probably have a much longer history of most other traditions. So talk about the tradition of exorcism historically, and then also, like, how do they prevent, because they do have some steps involved to prevent a situation where it's simply just this person's epileptic or, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you bring up a lot of very interesting topics, some sad, really, that the rite of exorcism is just like the liturgy of our church. This was something that, didn't just fall from heaven, right? It developed over time and became the best practices of the exorcism priests. The prayers have ancient origins, but the liturgy itself the rite itself has nuances that, that's kind of our living corpus of institutional knowledge about fighting the devil is the rite, right? That's, it's a beautiful thing. Sadly, right, something came upon, I guess, all the world, but the Catholic Church in post-Vatican II, 70s, 80s, there are a lot of Catholics, Christians started teaching that the devil's just the personification of societal sin, right? That he's not a real person or he's not a fallen angel, that's just all mythology. And it bit us in the butt because we stopped training. It went out of style temporarily just to train exorcists. And so a lot of that institutional knowledge faded away. Like one of the exorcisms is the exorcism of Emma Schmidt. You have this Capuchin monk he's just awesome. And he comes from a long line of exorcist priests. And some of that was, some of those great oaks were cut down. So, but we are, we're realizing that was a huge mistake, that the devil is not a figment of our imaginations, and the world is seeing the consequences of that. We're seeing exorcisms on the rise, not only because we're starting to attack the problem, but because the problem is intensifying. And we're having really good training going on again. Father Gabriel Almorth, the couple movies been made about him now, but the exorcist of the Diocese of Rome was a great teacher of exorcists, and now a lot of his students are becoming great teachers too. You have Father Vincent Lampert in the United States, Father Chad Ripperger. Father Chad Ripperger, who's also a psychologist, and he's amazing. Father Carlos Martins. I don't know if you've listened to that podcast, but that'll curl your nose hairs. He has some wonderful, amazing, terrifying stories of exorcism. So that's kind of the long and the short of the history of exorcisms. And I feel like there's another component of your question that I forgot to answer, though.
Yeah, well, we can actually kind of lean into the next question, which is, as this sort of rite of exorcism was established through history, obviously there's some particular markers that
right.
folks look for to establish that this is an actual genuine possession versus some sort of like medical issue. So talk a little bit about what are those signs or markers that they look for when assessing a potential exorcism.
Sure. To make sure, and there are always going to be in place, as we're reestablishing the rite of exorcism, you do have dioceses where the bishop may have appointed an exorcist priest, but they didn't necessarily provide him with the staff he needs to adequately assess and filter what's mental illness and what's bona fide supernatural possession, and not merely oppression or obsession. The varying degrees. But when it's done right, you have a cadre of psychologists that help the exorcist priest. That what the exorcist priest will have on when it gets to his desk is just those that have been filtered out as not explainable by mental illness alone. So some of those, and then what the exorcist priest can do is there's some pretty straightforward ways to distinguish between a purely natural illness and a supernatural illness. And one of those is the exorcist priest will have certain food blessed or certain water blessed and not blessed, and the possessed person will be able to tell the difference between what's blessed and what's not blessed. Father Carlos Martins has a really cool story of he just took the slightest droplet of holy water on the tip of his finger, like a drop of a drop, and just dropped it on the back of a person whose back was facing him, and the person arched backward like a cat and was suddenly looking at him eye to eye, but his head was, upside down relative to Father Martin's. So that's one way. Speaking languages that the person should have no would have had no encounter with in their life. Ancient biblical Hebrew. Really Latin and Greek. You can maybe have picked that up from TV, but some, ancient Aramaic, right? Sumerian. It's very unlikely, watching Sesame Street or TGIF, you're going to pick up some of these ancient languages. So that would be another marker. Exhibiting strength, far beyond what is natural. That would be another one. And The Exorcist book, and maybe the movie too, or maybe one of the 1,000 sequels. I can't remember. Can't say I've seen them all. But not only was the child words were rising from the flesh as well, like ancient Hebrew words or something like that. I don't know if that may be more fictionalized, but that would be an example of an unknown language. And you see that in a lot of these, like in the book I put together, a lot of these classic exorcisms, you see people speaking languages that they should have had no contact with. And I guess fourth, it kind of goes with the languages, but knowledge that they should not have, like what the priest did that day before getting there. Even the Desert Fathers, like St. Anthony of Egypt, they talk about how the demons would try to trick them, try to demonstrate an ability to prophesy or to know the future. But what they would do is they just know when somebody was leaving Antioch and were headed their direction. When that person then arrived at the doorstep of St. Anthony of Egypt, days later they would say, "See, I told you that person is going." Well, it's because they can be omnipresent, right? But they are not omniscient, right? They can't tell the future, but they can pretend to. A good illusionist, right?
Yeah, interesting. So, talk about some of the theories behind, because I know in every case that you recount in the book, there's some theorizing in terms of what specifically caused that child to become possessed, and they vary from individual to individual, and we can kind of break that down case by case. So maybe the best place to start would be with the first case that you talk about in the book, back in the late 1920s. And this one is fascinating just because of the fact that, for folks out there who have seen the movie The Exorcist, one of the most memorable scenes in the movie is where she vomits up this green stuff. It's disgusting. Yeah. And one would assume that was just something that was put into play as a way to spice up the movie and shock and awe people. But that actually was derived from a case of a little girl back in the late 1920s named Emma Schmidt, a.k.a. Anna Eklund, as was her pseudonym. And again, another teenager. She was, I believe, 14. So talk a little bit about that case and ultimately where they got this green vomit from.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that was one of the surprising. It's always a wonderful experience to write a book, to really get to learn a subject in depth, and to have your preconceived notions just destroyed, But yeah, so as you said, Emma Schmidt, her exorcism lasts between 1926 and 1928 in Iowa, right? Little charming Iowa, and you think nothing but fields of dreams could happen there. But she, what happened with her, pretty much all the other exorcisms I talked about in my book appeared in the 1900s, or one I cover appeared during the Protestant Reformation, so much further back. But all the more recent ones pretty much all involved a Ouija board. The child was exposed to a Ouija board, which is another thing that usually happens in childhood, right? It's just an innocent child's game, right? And then all of a sudden the child, starts bouncing off the ceiling, literally, right? So what happened with Emma Schmidt, though, was not a Ouija board. She had an aunt, and this is what the primary sources say. Schmidt's Aunt Mina was reputedly a witch, quote, who had placed a spell on some herbs which she placed among the girl's food, end quote. And the exorcist said to Emma's Aunt Mina, how long have you been torturing this poor girl? And, the exorcist asked, during the exorcism, he interviewed if it was the devil himself or one of the demons, said since her 14th year, since that started happening. But in the exorcism, it came out there's a slightly different origin, but it's from the demon. So take that for what it's worth. How dared you enter into that innocent girl and torture her like that? The devil sneering, ha! Did not her own father curse us into her? So, don't know, ultimately which one was the right one. I tend to go with the aunt thing, because that could be seemingly innocent, that she's just maybe trying to have some blessing. She thinks it's just a blessing on the herbs, but it's actually, witchcraft that opens a door.
Yeah, and the priest involved, Father Theophilus, he was interesting too, because he does also create like a control when he's sort of testing her to see if this is legitimate or not. Talk a little bit about what are the things that he did, because you mentioned earlier sort of mixing up food, some is blessed, some is not, just to see if you get a consistent reaction, which is sort of what he did with her back in the 20s.
Yeah, so and I also forgot to go back to the vomit too, because that's the take-home message from this particular exorcism. Well, among the things Father Theophilus did was discovered her supernatural strength. That didn't even really need to test that. Let's see, I've got. Father Theophilus had hardly begun the formula of exorcism in the name of the Blessed Trinity, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, in the name of the crucified Savior, when a hair-raising scene occurred. With lightning speed, the possessed dislodged herself from her bed and from the hands of her guards, right? She is being held down by like a whole order of nuns. They're like packed the nuns in there to hold this girl down. The possessed girl dislodged herself from her bed and from the hands of her guards, and her body, carried through the air, landed high above the door of the room and clung to the wall with a tenacious grip, like Spider-Girl here. All present were struck with a trembling fear. Father Theophilus alone kept his peace. And then, if that's not creepy enough, right? Like, she's gripping herself to the ceiling. These nuns, part of the reason they had to be there was, even though the girl did not eat during these exorcisms and had been without food, unable to keep food down because of the extent of the possession, the demon was torturing the girl's body in that way. She was nevertheless able to vomit up buckets and buckets of vomit, and just the most horrible smelling stuff. Like the nuns, who are used to doing some tough stuff in schools, and they were like fainting with the smell of it, and just rolling up their sleeves, carrying out bucket load after bucket load. It was. I don't know why they never made a movie out of this one. Well, maybe I do know. Yeah. Just the hours of footage of just this poor girl throwing up. Yeah, but just like, here's another half hour of... And yeah, so just the Father... So when I read... I'm reading from my book, but I'm reading from Father Vogel's account. He was kind of like a socius to Father Theophilus, like an assistant. Father Vogel described the torrents, quote-unquote, of vomit You say torrents? Actually, those present had to live through some terrible experiences. It was heartrending to see all that came forth from the pitiable creature, and often the ordeal was almost unbearable. They would fill a pitcher, yes, even a pail, full of the most obnoxious stench. Were most unnatural.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of From the Void. If you enjoyed this episode or any of the previous episodes, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing, and sharing with a friend. We'll be back with part 2 of my conversation with Scott Smith. And until then, you've been listening to From the Void.